CBS Young and the Restless, spoilers full. The sharp, unforgiving clatter of Diane Jenkins's heels against the imported Italian marble floors of the Abbott mansion echoed like a gavel striking a judge's block. Her back was rigid, her posture radiating a fierce, untouchable dignity that only barely masked the profound devastation simmering beneath the surface. She did not look back. She didn't need to. The air in the grand foyer was thick, practically vibrating with the tension of their explosive confrontation. Jack Abbott felt the oxygen leave the room. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his veins, paralyzing him for a microscopic fraction of a second before his survival instincts kicked in. His heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He had seen Diane angry before. He had seen her vindictive, calculating, and deeply hurt, but this was an entirely different beast. This was the raw, bleeding edge of a woman who had reached her absolute limit. He knew with a sickening, undeniable certainty that if she walked through those heavy oak doors and out into the biting Genoa City night, the fracture in their recently rebuilt marriage would widen into an unbridgeable chasm. "Diane, please, just wait." Jack's voice cracked, the desperate plea of a man watching his world slip through his fingers. He lunged forward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor as he scrambled to close the distance between them. He needed to diffuse this. He needed to pull her into his arms, to look into her eyes and promise her that they could weather this storm just as they had weathered so many others. He reached out his fingertips, brushing the silk of her coat. But before Jack could grasp Diane's sleeve, before he could utter another word of desperate reassurance, a shadow detached itself from the darkened archway of the adjoining study. A figure stepped directly into his path, blocking the grand entryway with a sudden jarring finality. Jack gasped, his momentum halting so abruptly that he nearly lost his balance. It was Patty Williams. The shock of seeing her materialized like a ghost from the darkest corners of his past stole the breath from his lungs. Patty stood there, bathed in the dim golden light of the foyer chandelier, looking like a tragic, broken doll. Her blonde hair was disheveled, falling in erratic waves around a face that was a terrifying canvas of deeply rooted trauma. But it was her eyes that anchored Jack to the spot. They were wide, glassy, and swirling, with a chaotic mixture of profound hurt and an ironclad, terrifying stubbornness. There was no mistaking the look. It was the gaze of a woman who had anchored her entire fractured reality to one man. Her lower lip trembled, but her jaw was set with a rigid determination that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. She didn't look like a woman who had just happened to wander into the Abbott estate. She looked like a woman who had crossed oceans of madness to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. "You are going to leave me again, Jackie," Patty whispered, her voice a chillingly soft melody that juxtaposed the heavy, suffocating tension in the room. The childhood nickname, spoken with such misplaced, desperate affection, felt like a physical blow to Jack's chest. Before Jack could process the impossibility of her presence, before he could even form a syllable of denial or command, Patty lunged. She didn't attack him with malice. She attacked him with an overwhelming, suffocating need. She threw her arms around his torso, burying her tear-streaked face deep into the lapel of his tailored suit jacket. Her grip was astonishingly strong, fueled by years of obsessive longing and manic delusion. Her fingers dug into his back, clutching the fabric of his jacket as if he were the only solid object in a world that was constantly crumbling beneath her feet. "I'm here, Jackie," she sobbed, her voice muffled against his chest. "I came back for you. You have to look at me. You have to see me. You can't just walk away like I don't exist." The physical sensation of her trap was paralyzing. She smelled of sweet, synthetic floral perfume, a scent that instantly transported Jack back to the most nightmarish chapters of his life. She was a living, breathing anchor, dragging him down into a whirlpool of past sins and unresolved tragedies. She pressed herself closer, her tears soaking through his shirt, her trembling body demanding his complete and undivided attention. She was forcing him to face her, to acknowledge the raw, bleeding emotions she carried, to validate the twisted narrative of love and abandonment that played on a continuous loop in her fragile mind. To Patty, this was a reunion written in the stars. To Jack, it was a suffocating nightmare that was actively destroying his present. Jack stood frozen, a prisoner in his own home, his hands hovering awkwardly in the air above Patty's trembling shoulders. His eyes darted frantically over her blonde head, fixed on the heavy oak front door. Through the narrow sidelight windows, he could see the red taillights of Diane's car illuminating the circular driveway. The engine roared to life, a sound that pierced through Patty's manic sobbing like a physical blade. He was violently torn, his mind fracturing under the weight of an impossible decision. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to shove Patty aside, to tear himself free from her obsessive clinging and sprint out the door after the woman he truly loved. Diane was slipping away, her trust shattering with every second he remained entangled with his unstable ex-wife. But the terrifying reality of Patty's mental state held him hostage. He knew the delicate, dangerous tightrope he was walking. If he pushed Patty away too violently, if he rejected her with the harshness, the situation demanded he risked triggering a violent, unpredictable psychotic break. Patty had a history of catastrophic reactions to rejection. She had wreaked unimaginable havoc on his family and his loved ones when her fragile reality was shattered. He couldn't risk her turning her volatile emotions into a weapon, not here, not now. But the clock was ticking. The taillights in the driveway shifted into gear. The claustrophobia of the moment was absolute. He was trapped between the desperate, obsessive ghost of his past and the rapidly fading reality of his future. The frantic beating of his heart echoed in his ears, drowning out Patty's continued babbling. He was a man suspended over a chasm, knowing that whichever way he fell, the damage would be catastrophic. Desperation clawed at Jack's throat. He needed to reason with her, to use the legendary Abbott charm and diplomacy that had navigated countless corporate wars. But as he looked down at Patty, his silver tongue failed him. His mouth was dry, his thoughts a chaotic jumble. Patty, please, you have to listen to me, Jack stammered, his voice devoid of its usual smooth, commanding cadence. He slowly, hesitantly lowered his hands to her shoulders, trying to apply just enough pressure to pry her away without sparking her fury. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. You shouldn't be here. It's not safe for you. I care about what happens to you, Patty. I really do, but you have to let me go. He tried to keep his tone soft, aiming for a de-escalating whisper, but the explanation came out clunky, harsh, and excruciatingly awkward. He sounded like a patronizing stranger reading off a script, and he knew it. He was trying to pacify a woman who demanded eternal devotion with the bureaucratic language of a crisis negotiator. I can't stay here with you right now, Jack, continued, stumbling over his own words as he gently tried to pry her white-knuckled fingers from his jacket. Diane is my wife. I have to go to her. We can get you help, Patty. We can find a way to make sure you're safe, but this isn't the way. Patty's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a sudden dark betrayal. She sensed the insincerity of his calm tone, the desperate urgency to be rid of her vibrating beneath his gentle touch. Her grip only tightened, her nails biting into his flesh through his clothes. Help! You think I need help. I only need you, Jack, she cried out, her voice rising in pitch, teetering dangerously on the edge of hysteria. The hesitation, the desperate attempt to manage Patty's fragile psyche with kid gloves cost him everything. In that agonizing stretch of seconds where Jack debated between force and diplomacy, the window of opportunity slammed shut. Just as he finally managed to detach, Patty's arms pushing her back by her shoulders and holding her at arm's length to look into her tear-streaked, defiant face, the unmistakable screech of tires against the asphalt cut. Through the heavy air of the mansion, Jack froze, his blood running cold. He snapped his head toward the door just in time to see the red glow of Diane's taillights disappear rapidly down the winding driveway, swallowed by the darkness of the estate's massive iron gates. The silence that followed the fading roar of the engine was deafening, broken only by Patty's ragged, uneven breathing. Jack stood completely still, his hands slowly dropping to his sides. A profound, hollow sickness settled in the pit of his stomach. He was too late. He had missed his chance. The physical distance between him and Diane was now absolute, a tangible manifestation of the emotional gulf that had just ripped open between them. He had allowed the ghost of his past to physically restrain him from saving his present. He closed his eyes, the crushing weight of his failure pressing down on his chest. The consequences of that missed moment manifested the very next day, a reckoning that Jack had dreaded with every fiber of his being. When he finally tracked Diane down to her private suite at the Genoa City Athletic Club, the atmosphere was frigid, devoid of any of the warmth that usually defined their intimate moments. Diane did not yell. She did not throw things. Her wrath was a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly quiet fury. She stood by the window, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, looking at him not with the fiery passion of a lover scorned, but with the utter devastating disappointment of a woman who had realized her faith was misplaced. "You chose her," Jack Diane stated, her voice dangerously level, slicing through his desperate apologies like a scalpel. "In the moment when our marriage was on the line, when I needed you to prove that I was your priority, you chose to coddle her madness over protecting our relationship." "Diane, you know that's not true," Jack pleaded, stepping forward, though the icy glare in her eyes kept him from crossing the room. "She is sick. She is dangerous. I was trying to prevent a tragedy. And in doing so, you created one right here." Diane countered, her voice finally cracking with a sliver of the immense pain she was harboring. "You always do this, Jack. You always let the ghosts of your past, the broken women you feel compelled to save, dictate our future. You stood there and let her hold you while I walked out the door. That is a tragedy I refuse to live with." Later that evening, alone in the cavernous, eerily quiet study of the Abbott mansion, Jack poured himself a generous glass of bourbon. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it did nothing to dull the sharp, agonizing edges of his reality. As he sat in his leather armchair, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to align in his mind. Patty Williams was supposed to be locked away in a high-security psychiatric facility miles away from Genoa City. She was heavily medicated, closely monitored, and entirely devoid of the financial resources or logistical capability to orchestrate a sudden, stealthy return to his living room. She hadn't just wandered back into his life by coincidence. Someone had opened the door. Someone had provided the transportation, bypassed the security, and pointed her directly at his Achilles heel. There was only one man in the world with the money, the power, the lack of moral boundaries, and the deeply ingrained vindictive hatred required to pull off such a flawlessly cruel maneuver. Victor Newman, the mustache. Jack's knuckles turned white as his grip tightened around the crystal tumbler. Victor had used Patty as a pawn before exploiting her mental illness to strike at Jack. This was Victor's revenge for their latest corporate war, a calculated surgical strike designed to dismantle Jack's life from the inside out using the most volatile weapon available. The realization of Victor's likely involvement did nothing to soothe the immediate crisis. It only magnified the sheer scale of the disaster. Jack and Diane's relationship, a union that had miraculously survived fake deaths, decades of bitter animosity, and the relentless skepticism of everyone in Genoa City, was now standing on the absolute brink of destruction. Patty's sudden chaotic presence had become a toxic wedge driven straight into the heart of their marriage. Diane, a woman who had fought tooth and nail to secure her place as the matriarch of the Abbott family, outright refused to live in a house where she felt she would always play second fiddle to Jack's deeply ingrained savior. Complex, she refused to share her husband with the relentless, haunting traumas of his past. The foundation of their love, which they had spent the last few years painstakingly rebuilding brick by brick, was now cracking violently under the immense, unyielding weight of Patty's obsession. The trust was gone, replaced by a lingering, poisonous doubt that Jack would always prioritize the crises of his former lovers over the stability of his wife. As the fire died down to glowing embers, Jack was left alone in the dark with the crushing realization of his own complicity. His momentary choice, the split-second decision to handle Patty with gentle diplomacy, instead of immediately tearing himself away to chase his furious wife, had birthed a monstrous hydra of unexpected troubles. He was now trapped in a labyrinth of his own making, pushed into an agonizingly difficult dilemma with no clear exit. On one side, he was now responsible for managing a fragile, highly dangerous Patty Williams who genuinely believed that his gentle words in the foyer meant they had a future together. If he shattered that delusion now, he risked unleashing a wave of violence and chaos upon his family. On the other side, he was facing the very real, very imminent loss of Diane, the woman who held his heart. Furthermore, if his suspicions were correct and Victor Newman was indeed pulling the strings from the shadows, Jack was walking blindly into a meticulously laid trap. Any move he made to dispose of Patty or win back Diane would likely trigger whatever secondary snare Victor had set waiting for him. Jack Abbott, a man who had spent his entire life commanding boardrooms and outmaneuvering corporate titans, now found himself utterly cornered. His choices had created a perfect storm of emotional devastation and psychological warfare, leaving him isolated, desperate, and staring into the abyss of a life completely unraveled by the relentless echoes of his past. The silence of the mansion pressed in on him, a heavy, suffocating reminder that the battle for his future had only just begun, and he was already losing. The bourbon in his glass was gone, but the bitter taste of defeat lingered long after the final drop. He had tried to save everyone in that fleeting moment in the foyer, and in doing so, he had virtually guaranteed that he would lose it all. The heavy mahogany door of the yacht's master's stateroom slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the opulent, suffocating space. The vibration rattled the crystal whiskey glasses on the nightstand, but the true tremor tore straight through Jack Abbott's chest. He stumbled forward, his legs feeling like lead, the lingering haze of the drugged liquor fighting against the adrenaline of sheer, unadulterated panic. Diane, wait, it's not what it looks like. Jack's voice was a ragged, desperate tear in the silence of the cabin, but he was too late. She was gone. The image of her face was already burning itself into his memory, a brand upon his conscience that he knew would never fade. Diane Jenkins had stood in that doorway, her eyes wide, with a devastation so profound it had physically stolen the breath from her lungs. She had walked in to rescue her husband, only to find him entangled on the bed with Patty Williams, his lips on hers, his jacket discarded, the room thick with the undeniable damning atmosphere of intimacy. Diane hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown anything. She had simply looked at him with a shattered, hollow betrayal that spoke louder than 1,000 accusations, turned on her heel, and fled into the night air of Lake Michigan. Jack gripped the edge of the teak wood dresser, his knuckles turning white as he fought a wave of chemically induced dizziness. The metallic tang of fear coated the back of his throat. The scent of Patty's cloying perfume still hung heavy in the air, a sickening reminder of the trap that had just snapped shut around his throat. He had tried to push Patty away, had tried to fight the lethargy, pulling him under, but the timing had been too perfect, too precise. His marriage, the fragile, beautiful trust he and Diane had painstakingly rebuilt from the ashes of their tumultuous past, had just been obliterated in a matter of seconds. Before Jack could propel his heavy limbs toward the door to chase after his wife, a slow, rhythmic sound drifted from the shadowed corridor of the yacht. Tap, step, tap, step. It was a sound Jack knew as intimately as his own heartbeat, a sound that had heralded his worst nightmares for decades. The rhythmic strike of a walking stick against the polished floorboards. The cabin door, which Diane had just slammed shut, swung open with agonizing slowness. Victor Newman stepped into the dim amber light of the stateroom. He looked immaculate, draped in a custom-tailored dark suit that absorbed the light, his posture rigid and commanding. But it was his face that made the blood freeze in Jack's veins. Victor's features were arranged in a mask of absolute terrifying triumph. His dark eyes locked onto Jack, gleaming with a malicious, mocking amusement as he took in the pathetic scene, the rumpled bed, the discarded clothing, and Jack Abbott clutching the dresser like a drowning man. Victor did not speak immediately. He didn't have to. He stood there, savoring the palpable aura of brokenness that saturated the room. He let the silence stretch, allowing Jack to fully absorb the reality of his presence. Victor Jack breathed the name, tasting like poison on his tongue. The fog in his brain began to violently burn away, replaced by a surging white-hot inferno of rage. You! Hello, Jack, Victor rumbled, his iconic baritone voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. He stepped further into the room, leaning casually on his cane, a monarch surveying a conquered province. You look disheveled. I trust you enjoyed your cruise. Jack lunged forward, his hands curling into fists, but his drugged equilibrium betrayed him. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the bed frame, panting heavily. You son of a bitch! You did this! You orchestrated all of it. Victor offered a slow, chilling smile. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a mere curving of the lips that conveyed nothing but contempt. You always were quick to point fingers, Jack. But in this particular instance, you are entirely correct. Victor began to pace the length of the room, his every movement deliberate and calculated. Did you honestly believe, Jack, that you could simply walk to your car in the Jabot parking garage without consequence? Did you think I would allow you to continue your pathetic existence while my legacy, my company, was being held hostage by your insufferable family, the black SUV, the men who so efficiently subdued you, all on my payroll? Bringing you to this floating cage in Kenosha was child's play.